Welcome, Dara Austin. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Welcome. Would you join me in prayer, please? O Creator God, Sustainer and Redeemer, we're here tonight to walk this journey and to learn more and to follow in your footprints. As your Son Jesus Christ welcomed the stranger, so should we. So we thank you for this evening, and we thank you for the people that are here willing to open their hearts and their minds to new ways of thinking, to learning, to ask questions, to glean more information. We give thanks for our speakers tonight and for what they bring to the table. So we just ask, God, that you keep our hearts open, our minds alert, and help us to respond in the way that we know that you would respond to welcoming the stranger. It is in your Son's name that we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Tara. In an effort to give the majority of time to our speakers, you've been given a brief bio that is ever so brief, given how extraordinary these two people are who join us this evening. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Layla Amara.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much again for having me back to your lovely church. I'm really just so impressed with everything that Anne and the church has done to hear from the refugee resettlement contingency and those in the Fort Worth community and surrounding areas that are working with refugees. And so it means so much to me that y'all have taken time out of your schedule to put this together and then also to come and hear not only tonight, but I know on multiple nights y'all have had events. So I just want to thank you very much for being interested to hear what we do and to be involved. So while we wait for the slides, I'll start off by asking who in the audience has had experience with refugees, if any. I'm always so curious to have a better understanding for the audience that I'm speaking to, and you may not have had an intimate experience with somebody and gotten to know them, but you may have run into refugees in the community. Oh, wow. I never get that many hands. How about you?
Mine?
Uh-huh.
I was in Albuquerque working here.
Okay.
And there was a lady who was trying to help them after they were done with Catholic services.
Okay.
And she wanted to teach them how to sew. Well, these people, we didn't even know what a sewing machine looked like.
Uh-huh.
In those cases, one's from Africa, the one's from Nepal. They were good with knitting and all that kind of stuff. They already knew what they were doing.
Uh-huh.
Provided a place for them to go.
Okay, great.
It was really very interesting and difficult.
Yeah, it's a difficult transition. So they must have just been resettled recently.
Yeah, some of them been here for 5 years, but their English and everything is not good. It was
Anyone else want to share their experience?
I was not maybe would be classified true refugee, but I have two girls that are from Bosnia that came in '93 after the war.
Wow, yes.
And where I retired from a small university in Tennessee, so they had to have families assume responsibility. They had to provide all the gifts in kind. And I'm proud to say that both of them are citizens.
Wow.
And they both have earned all 3 degrees.
Wow, that's amazing.
They're teaching, one's in Tennessee and one's in Arizona. And the stories, the very first few years' stories are,
Yeah, they're hard. They're hard to hear. And they actually came in the 90s, and I wasn't working in resettlement then, but there were a lot of Bosnians that came back in the 90s. This is an image from UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And they do a lot of these public campaigns. So it's asking the question, what would you do if you were in that situation? And it gives you two very bad options, in my opinion. One is to stay and risk your life. and the other is to flee and risk kidnap, rape, torture, or worse, i.e. your life. So it's a very, very hard decision. I don't think that any refugee comes to that decision lightly. When you're put in a situation like that, it's hard to know what you would do or what that really feels like. And, I can only share sort of a secondary experience. My father is a Palestinian refugee, and he doesn't talk often about his flight from Palestine, but when he does, you hear this kind of lingering in the background. And he was 8 when he fled, but there are stories, that people literally got up and left within moments of hearing that, somebody was coming to the village to do harm. And so, he tells the story of leaving really literally within one day and getting on the back of a truck and being driven, hours away into what is now the West Bank. He was from a little village close to Jaffa. If you're familiar with the Holy Land, he always likes to say he's from the Holy Land. So, and going to Jericho, where he became a refugee and literally lived in a tent and then a mud hut. And it wasn't until he was in his junior year that he actually left and went to high school in Amman, and then wound up going to the United States eventually, where he went to college and met my mother at the University of Houston. And but it was a couple of years after he left that his family from the West Bank actually had to flee again in 1967 in a similar story, leaving and crossing the Jordanian River into Amman, where they now live. And so many of my family members were able to, get an education and improve their lives and live a somewhat normal life. But I have other family members who quite literally still live in refugee camps in Amman. One of my aunts, again, started off as a kind of a tent community refugee camp. They started building little homes with cinder blocks, and she still lives in that home. And so, and you hear about, in this whole situation with Syria, you still hear about Palestinian camps in Syria and Lebanon being affected once again. And so, that this question is just so poignant from where I stand. Do you stay or do you leave? And in some cases, people don't have that choice. They either have to leave and be resettled, or they have to go back to their country of origin, which is also not a good option. So I wanted to tell you briefly about a story of one of our clients, and this also relates to that question. This family is from Syria, and they really didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay. And they stayed from when the war started in 2011 to about 2013. They really tried to stay on. And they actually lived through a couple of bombings in their neighborhood. And it was the second explosion that wounded their daughter. And they said, okay, we cannot stay. The first bombing, actually, their son had his 2 middle fingers amputated. And so they tried to stay after that, but then when this happened, it was just abundantly clear that they really had no other choice but to leave or risk their lives. And so that's when they fled. And they fled to Lebanon and stayed in Lebanon for about 1.5 years until they were able to be resettled in the United States. So they applied for the program, went through all the security checks and the medical checks, and then were able to resettle. And they've done amazingly well. They're now living in Dallas. They were originally resettled in Fort Worth, and we were able to refer them to our intensive case management program, where she worked very closely with the family to get them a new prosthetic for their daughter. So this is the one that she was given in Syria, but now she has a new one. And she's connected to services where she goes in on a frequent basis and is able to get the medical care that she needs to get, when a child has a prosthetic, they have to continue to grow into it, and it has to change frequently, which is quite expensive. But she's enrolled in services that allow her to do that. So the father's working, and they've for the most part, been able to adjust to their new lives. You know, they're studying English, and the mother is able to stay home with the children and care for them. They have 4 children. So really a good success story, but ultimately that really difficult decision that, you know, they had to pick up from where they lived, leave everything behind, leave their family behind, leave their, you know, for him, he had a business there. He had to leave that behind and start all over again. And we're talking from the ground up, new language, new culture, new livelihood. So really, really tough decision. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about how we don't provide these services in a vacuum. And I've been doing this since 2008. Beforehand, I worked a little bit with other humanitarian organizations, both here in the United States and abroad. And I think when I decided to come back to Fort Worth, I wasn't really sure what to expect. I knew that I wanted to keep an international perspective in my work, and I thought, okay, well, how am I going to do that in Fort Worth? So I started doing a little bit of research and just found refugee resettlement, and I really had no idea that there was refugee resettlement here in this area at all, or that there was even a program. So I was very happy to realize that there was an option for me, and was able to get a position with RST, and have been working with them since 2008. And it's been a really nice fit, but I've been so pleasantly surprised at how welcoming of a community Fort Worth is. And all the years that I've been doing this, it really hasn't been until recently that we've bumped up against any kind of negativity in our community, which just says a whole lot for Fort Worth. And Fort Worth really is one of the largest giving communities in the nation statistically, not only monetarily, but just with time and volunteer effort. They're a very engaged community, and we've definitely felt that over the years. Refugee resettlement also has a long legacy of working with faith-based communities, and especially in the churches. So refugee resettlement actually stems from churches welcoming refugees into the United States, and it really started, you know, in the very early 20th century with refugees fleeing over here and churches welcoming them into the fold and providing them with what they needed to get started in the new country. And you definitely can see that after World War II and with the Vietnamese refugees. Before the resettlement program started in 1980, it was really, for the most part, performed by churches. So, as you have heard in the media, recently our industry has been highly politicized. And, you know, it wasn't really until this year that I could even walk into a room and say refugee resettlement and anyone knew what I was talking about. And now it seems like everybody has a little bit of an understanding. Of course, there's some misconceptions, but they understand that refugees are coming into our community, that there's some sort of system around that arrival. It's not in a vacuum. But there still are quite a few misconceptions, and so we definitely want to be out in the community talking about our program and clarifying any of those misunderstandings so that, you know, we're not susceptible to the fear-mongering, I think, that's going on right now in these days of elections, especially. I'm hoping that on November 9th it'll all be over, but we don't know that. So one thing I wanted to talk about, we recently have been going through a lot of change in our program. And I won't get into the nuts and bolts of it, but I'm sure that you've heard somewhat in the news that the state of Texas has decided to pull out of the refugee resettlement program. And that did officially happen on September 30th. Abbott decided that because the federal government couldn't give him the assurances that he was asking for, that they would just altogether pull out. So a couple of things around that. They are a pass-through entity for the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which does some of the integration funding. And he was basically asking them for security assurances and assurances around the number of refugee arrivals, both of which cannot be done through that agency. That's a function of the State Department. So he was asking these things from this agency that really had no jurisdiction over that area. So it was sort of a moot point, and but he was making a point. And he said that if they could not agree to those things, then they would have to pull out. Well, they did that on September 30th, but rest assured that will not affect our services. The funding is still there through the federal government, so it's a matter of us putting together a new nonprofit to sort of sit in the place and become the pass-through entity. So we're waiting for that. Everyone's talking about it within our industry and brainstorming on how we're going to move forward. We have technically 120 days to make this decision, which is really not that much time to put together a new entity. And so we're hoping that we maybe can do something in the meantime, and maybe after this fiscal year, which ends next September 30th, that we can buy some time until that point and put something solidly together. That's the Health and Human Services. And so that's where the Office of Refugee Resettlement sits at the federal level. It's a federal agency, but you also see it duplicated at the state agency. And most likely one of the reasons that the state of Texas and other states across the nation have become a pass-through entity is because some of that funding goes towards what we call refugee medical assistance, which is refugee Medicaid, which refugees get for about 8 months. So there was already sort of a pass-through going on from the federal government through the state, and so they included the refugee programs in that. Yes? Mm-hmm. So the conversation is on multiple levels. It's with the local resettlement agencies, and then it's with our national affiliates. And those national affiliates, those are those faith-based agencies that we work with to resettle refugees. And they're mostly working with the State Department through the Arrivals Program. So they have a big say in this as well. And then we're also talking with ORR. And PRM has a voice in this as well, the Population of Refugees and Migration, which is a bureau that sits in the State Department. So there's multiple levels that are talking, and this has just recently happened in New Jersey and in Kansas, where both of those states just recently pulled out of the program, the same thing that Texas has done. They're much smaller states. So one of the agencies in those states, the International Rescue Committee, was able to step up and step into that role. And so, it's been a little bit of an easier transition. But Texas is such a large resettlement state. I think that there's not one agency at this point that's able to step into that role because it's just such a massive program. We look at the state of Texas is the largest resettlement state, and then you look at Houston. I mean, Houston combined is probably as large as some of those other states altogether. So it's just the vastness of Texas just lends itself to needing a different model than just having one agency step up. So, but ultimately, it's ORR that's going to have to say, okay, then that's the direction we're going to go in. That's what we're deciding on. So I think right now the conversation is, it's ORR is the Office of Refugee Resettlement. I'm so sorry about all the acronyms. We speak in the language of acronyms. ORR is the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Yes. So for the FY17 program, we will continue to see a large number of Congolese arrive, as well as a continuation of Syrian refugees. But by and far, the Congolese refugees are going to be our largest population this fiscal year.
What's the rate of arrival from?
Say that again.
What's the rate of arrival from?
We don't have the final statistics for FY16, but right now we're looking at, for our office, just here in Fort Worth, about 35% of our arrivals being from Congo. Yeah, but those numbers should come out soon. Usually the Office of Immigration and Refugee Assistance in Austin puts those numbers together, so we're hoping within the next few weeks we'll get those. And it also looks very different for different offices. Some will have many more Syrians, some will have many more Iraqis or Somalis. We're a very diverse refugee resettlement program here in Texas, so you see many different populations. I'm going to go over some statistics really quickly. For some of you that were here on the 29th, I did go over some of these, but I wanted to make sure everybody knew sort of the vastness of the refugee situation in our world right now. So worldwide, there's approximately 60 million refugees, and I feel sorry for the person that gets to count those numbers because it's an ever-changing situation. It's very fluid. It's very hard to count because the movement is just constant, consistent, and can be relatively quick. So within the 60 million, you see 38 million are internally displaced persons. 1 million is asylum seekers, and then 20 million are refugees. And so it's that official refugee population that is being pulled into the resettlement programs, and that designation is given by UNHCR. A slide of where most of our clients are from. We are still resettling from Burma, otherwise known as Myanmar, Iraq. Some still are coming from Bhutan, Congolese, Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia. There's also an immigration program called the Special Immigrant Visa Program, and they do come in and go through the refugee resettlement program, but they are allies of the U.S. Army military, or they worked with one of our contracting companies over in Iraq or Afghanistan. And so many of our soldiers are fighting to bring those allies over here because some of them have been lost in the system and are waiting and being persecuted while they're in their home countries. I wanted to show you some pictures of refugee camps so you could get a little bit of an idea of where some of the clients are coming from, what kind of situation they're in. This is, I believe, the Zaatari camp in Jordan. And you can see it looks like a little city. And they actually say it's the 5th largest city in all of Jordan. That's it. That's a real image of it. It's just out in the middle of the desert. And we have heard from some of our clients who tell us that they went to the Zaatari camp and they left the very next day because they just really the misery and the difficulty of living that kind of life is just so hard. They didn't want to get stuck there. I believe this is in Kenya. So the average wait for resettlement is 7 years and can be much longer, can go up to decades. People have lived lives in these refugee camps. And I want to touch again, I spoke about this a little bit last time, Anne, so forgive me. I really want to emphasize, the heart of the resettlement program and the legacy that we have in the United States for resettlement, whether it be official resettlement or resettlement, through our communities. So really going back much further than when the refugee resettlement program started in 1980, we have been welcoming refugees to our shores. And you can see the numbers. So 250,000 Europeans from World War II. So the numbers we're resettling right now are lower than that, but we have traditionally resettled, in larger numbers. And right now you can see in 2017, which is the fiscal year that we just entered, the presidential determination is at 110,000. So there was a big dip after 9/11, a big dip in arrivals, and now we see the program sort of, reaching back up to those prior levels. So for RST, we are a statewide organization. We have offices across the state of Texas, not only in Fort Worth. Our main office is in Dallas, but we also have offices in Houston, Austin, and Amarillo. And our mission is really to welcome the stranger, displaced persons into our community and help them to integrate and thrive in that new community. A few of the services that we offer. You can see the picture here. This is one of our bus orientations. So one of the biggest things we can do is to help our clients become self-sufficient with transportation. It's so important. Even though the transportation system in Fort Worth is minimal at best, there is a transportation system. And so our clients really do need to, in order to become self-sufficient and thrive, they really do need to learn how to take the bus and get to their medical appointments, get to work if possible by bus. And so this is one of our orientations. We work with some interpretation services. We also have a list of interpreters that we work from, and we have them come in and go with us on the bus, go with the clients, and teach them how to use the tickets and where to get off. So that's one of the more important things that we're working on with them. Another is our ESL classes. You can see here from this picture. We have an 80-hour class that those that have low enough English enter into in the very first days that they're here. Even before we work with them on employment, they're in these classes 4 days a week, 9 to 12. They're working on their emergency English so that they can go to the grocery store and do an interview if they are looking for work. So some very basic take the bus, some of the things that we don't think about, just some emergency vocabulary that they need in their first days.
So are they coming from different languages there in the same room?
Yes, they're all, it's an ESL class, yes, and so there's multiple languages, but the only language you're speaking is English. And so we have some amazing ESL teachers. I mean, they're just really stunning. So we're really lucky in that way. And then they need more English than what we're able to give them. I think it's statistically, 500 hours of English to really have a working knowledge of the language. And we're offering 80. That's what our funding offers. And so many times when our clients need additional language and are interested, show a strong interest, we'll help get them connected to Tarrant County Community College or Fort Worth ISD. They offer some additional language classes, adult level classes. So we get them hooked up with those. So I love this quote. Never doubt that a group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I think that just exemplifies the work that we do. It's just really members of the community have just really stepped in to welcome these families and made some of our programs just so powerful by mentoring clients, working with them in some of the areas that we really cannot work with them in. We're limited in our time. And so we really rely on the community members to step in and mentor our families and walk with them hand in hand through this transition. It's just so important. And so we see that all the time. I wanted just to show a few pictures of some of the refugees that we've had in our nation that we may or may not know that they were refugees themselves. Of course, I think most everyone knows Albert Einstein. And the refugee resettlement program used to really center around bringing, sort of this intellectual capacity into our country. And of course, now that's really changed, and it's become purely humanitarian program. But we used to see, some of these members of other nations being persecuted, and they would come to the United States for refuge. And these are just some of the things that we work with our community on. Financial support, of course. Welcome Teams is a huge initiative of RSTs right now across all 5 of our offices. It's in our strategic plan. We really want to see community members, churches, it can be faith-based organizations, university groups. We've even had fraternities become welcome teams, but it's a group of about 5 to 8 people typically that come together, and they help us to set up the apartment for our clients before they even arrive. They greet them at the airport, and then they bring them back to their home and typically work with them in a mentoring capacity for about 3 to 4 months. And you should just really hear some of the stories, not from our clients, from the welcome teams themselves about how enriching that experience is. It's really a mutually beneficial relationship, and I think both sides get so much from it. General volunteers, in-kind donations. So we actually have an apartment complex where you saw our ESL class. That apartment complex has donated a 4-bedroom apartment to us, and in that apartment we have a clothing bank and a food pantry. And so we take in-kind donations. A lot of times when our clients arrive, they have next to nothing. They may have 1 or 2 bags for a family of 8, 9. And so they're in immediate need of clothing, especially now as we shift into the winter months. They'll definitely need jackets and additional blankets. I wanted to say a little word about advocacy. It's just so important that we're advocating for our program. It's not on any of our job duties officially, but it's something that I firmly believe in, especially in this sort of tense political climate, that we're calling our representatives and letting them know that we support this program. I think they all too often hear from the other side of the aisle or the other side of this of this program, and hear from those that don't want the program in their community. But we've heard from some of our representatives that they very rarely hear from us. And so it's really important that we are figuring out who our representatives are. And these are numbers that you can, you just dial that number, give your address, and they'll tell you who your representative or senator is if you don't know. And there's even some scripts there that we use to call them. Let us not forget that on the Statue of Liberty itself, it welcomes refugees to our shores.